The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Moravia like a shroud. But beneath its veil, the greatest military mind in history was about to orchestrate his masterpiece. The 2nd of December, 1805, the anniversary of Napoleon's coronation. As the sun began to pierce through the fog, it would illuminate not just a battlefield, but the moment when one man's genius would shatter the dreams of two emperors and reshape the very foundations of Europe itself. This is the story of Austerlitz, Napoleon's greatest triumph, where cunning defeated numbers, where deception crushed overwhelming odds, and where a single day's work would echo through the corridors of power for generations. By the time the sun set on that December evening, the Holy Roman Empire would be gasping its last breath. Austria would be broken, Russia would retreat in tears, and Napoleon Bonaparte would stand as the undisputed master of continental Europe. But how does one man, outnumbered and seemingly outmaneuvered, turn certain defeat into legendary victory? How does a retreating army become the hammer that crushes two of Europe's greatest powers in a single devastating blow? The answer lies not just in tactics or terrain, but in understanding the dark art of making your enemies believe exactly what you want them to believe, even when it leads them straight into the jaws of destruction. To understand the magnitude of what Napoleon achieved at Austerlitz, we must first grasp the impossible situation he faced in the autumn of 1805. Europe had united against him once again. The Third Coalition, a formidable alliance of Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden, had pooled their resources to finally bring down the French emperor, who had dared to crown himself and remake the continent in his image. The coalition's plan was elegant in its simplicity. While the British Royal Navy dominated the seas, Russian armies would march west to link up with Austrian forces. Together, they would field over 300,000 men against Napoleon's scattered forces. Meanwhile, Prussia hovered on the sidelines, ready to join the coalition once Napoleon showed signs of weakness. The net was closing from every direction. Napoleon found himself in a strategic nightmare. His Grande Armée, roughly 200,000 strong, was spread across a vast front. Worse still, he had been forced to abandon his invasion plans for Britain after the disaster at Trafalgar, where Admiral Nelson had shattered the combined French and Spanish fleets. The seas belonged to Britain, and now the land forces of his enemies were converging like wolves sensing wounded prey. In Vienna, Emperor Francis II of Austria felt the weight of destiny on his shoulders. The Habsburg dynasty had ruled the Holy Roman Empire for centuries, and now this upstart Corsican threatened to tear down everything his ancestors had built. His armies, seasoned and disciplined, marched with the confidence that comes from fighting for hearth and home. Far to the east, Tsar Alexander I of Russia burned with youthful ambition and righteous fury. At 28, he saw himself as the liberator of Europe, the man who would drive the French devil back to his island prison. His soldiers, hardened by the brutal Russian winters and endless steppes, carried with them the mystique of the nation that had never truly been conquered. The mathematics of the situation seemed insurmountable for Napoleon. By early November, Austrian General Mack had positioned 50,000 troops at Ulm, while another Austrian army under Archduke Charles operated in Italy. The main Allied force, a combined Russian-Austrian army of 90,000 men under the experienced Russian General Kutuzov, was advancing steadily through Moravia. Napoleon's scattered forces appeared hopelessly outnumbered and outpositioned. But Napoleon Bonaparte was not called the god of war for nothing. Where others saw impossible odds, he saw opportunity. Where his enemies saw their inevitable triumph, he began weaving the web that would become their destruction. The first threads of his masterpiece began at Ulm, where Napoleon demonstrated the lightning warfare that had made him legendary. Instead of retreating or seeking defensive positions, he struck like a thunderbolt. In a campaign lasting barely 2 weeks, he surrounded and captured General Mack's entire army of 50,000 men without fighting a single major battle. The Austrians, who had expected to advance triumphantly toward the Rhine, instead found themselves prisoners, their weapons stacked in neat piles as Napoleon's soldiers counted the spoils. The psychological impact of Ulm rippled across Europe like an earthquake. In a single stroke, Napoleon had eliminated a quarter of the coalition forces and proven once again that conventional military thinking meant nothing when facing his revolutionary approach to warfare. But more importantly, Ulm was merely the opening move in a game so complex that his enemies would not understand they had been checkmated until it was far too late. With Mack's army eliminated, Napoleon turned his attention to the main Allied force under Kutuzov. The Russian general was no fool. He had witnessed Napoleon's campaigns from afar and understood that facing the French emperor in open battle was tantamount to suicide. Kutuzov's strategy was patience itself: retreat steadily, draw the French deeper into hostile territory, allow winter and extended supply lines to do what Austrian and Russian bayonets might not accomplish. For weeks, the two armies engaged in a deadly dance across the Austrian countryside. Kutuzov would establish defensive positions, and Napoleon would advance. Just as battle seemed inevitable, the Russians would slip away in the night, leaving only empty camps and cold ashes. The French pursued like hunting hounds, but their quarry remained tantalizingly out of reach. To observers, it appeared that Napoleon was being led on a fool's errand. His army was marching deeper into enemy territory with each passing day, their supply lines growing ever more tenuous. Winter was approaching, and every mile they traveled took them further from friendly territory. The coalition leaders began to whisper that perhaps the great Napoleon had finally met his match in the wily Kutuzov. But appearances, as Napoleon knew better than anyone, could be magnificently deceiving. The truth was far more sinister. Napoleon was not being led by Kutuzov, he was herding him. Every retreat, every defensive position, every seemingly clever Russian maneuver was pushing the Allied army exactly where Napoleon wanted them to go. Like a chess master thinking 10 moves ahead, he was positioning his pieces for a combination that would leave his opponents speechless. The destination Napoleon had chosen for this deadly game was a small town in Moravia called Austerlitz. Here, the terrain offered everything a tactical genius could desire. Rolling hills provided natural defensive positions, while the famous Pratzen Heights dominated the surrounding countryside like a medieval castle. Whoever controlled those heights could rain death down upon any army foolish enough to venture into the valleys below. As November drew to a close, the Allied army finally took the bait. Kutuzov, despite his caution, found himself in an impossible position. The Tsar Alexander and Emperor Francis were both present with the army, and their patience with endless retreating had reached its limit. The young Tsar, in particular, burned with the desire to face Napoleon in open battle and claim the glory that would cement his place in history. The stage was set, the actors were in position, and Napoleon was about to reveal why he was considered the greatest military mind of his generation. But first, he would need to convince two emperors that they were about to witness his destruction, not their own. The art of deception in warfare is not merely about telling lies. It is about crafting a reality so convincing that your enemies will march willingly into their own annihilation. As the Allied forces converged on the plains around Austerlitz, Napoleon began to weave the most elaborate deception of his career, a performance so masterful that it would fool two emperors and their most experienced generals. The curtain rose on this deadly theater when Napoleon made a decision that shocked his own marshals. He ordered his army to abandon the Pratzen Heights, the commanding high ground that any competent general would fight to the death to hold. The heights offered everything a defender could want: clear fields of fire, natural defensive positions, and the ability to observe enemy movements for miles in every direction. To give up such an advantage seemed like the act of a desperate man, or perhaps a fool. But Napoleon was neither desperate nor foolish. He was a predator, and he had just laid the most irresistible bait imaginable before his prey. The Allied commanders could scarcely believe their eyes as French forces withdrew from the heights in apparent disarray. Columns of soldiers trudged down the slopes, their heads hanging low, their movements suggesting exhaustion and demoralization. Supply wagons creaked and groaned under hastily packed equipment. Officers barked orders with voices that carried notes of panic and uncertainty. To the watching Russians and Austrians, it appeared that Napoleon's legendary army was finally cracking under the pressure of their relentless pursuit. The myth of French invincibility was crumbling before their very eyes, and the heights beckoned like a crown waiting to be claimed. Emperor Francis II and Tsar Alexander I held their first joint war council on the captured heights, surrounded by their finest generals and advisors. The mood was electric with anticipation. Maps were spread across makeshift tables as staff officers traced potential battle lines with confident fingers. The mathematics seemed simple enough: 90,000 Allied troops against perhaps 70,000 French, and now they held the high ground that Napoleon had so foolishly abandoned. Young Alexander was particularly animated, his eyes bright with the prospect of glory. He had dreamed of this moment, the chance to face the great Napoleon in battle and emerge victorious. The Tsar spoke of decisive charges and crushing victories, of liberating Europe from the French yoke. His enthusiasm was infectious, spreading through the Allied camp like wildfire. General Kutuzov, however, remained silent during much of these discussions. The grizzled veteran had survived too many campaigns to trust in appearances, no matter how convincing. Something about the French withdrawal troubled him, though he could not quite articulate his concerns. Napoleon had never retreated from a strong position without good reason, and Kutuzov doubted the French emperor had suddenly lost his tactical genius. But Kutuzov's caution was drowned out by the chorus of younger voices calling for immediate attack. Why wait when victory seemed so certain? Why allow Napoleon time to recover when he was clearly on the brink of collapse? The pressure from both emperors was immense, and eventually, even the experienced Russian general began to doubt his own instincts. Meanwhile, Napoleon was orchestrating his deception with the precision of a master conductor. Every detail of the French retreat had been carefully choreographed to reinforce the illusion of weakness. Soldiers were instructed to appear dejected and weary. Officers were told to argue loudly within earshot of enemy scouts. Supply trains were deliberately left in disarray to suggest panic and poor organization. The French emperor even went so far as to request a meeting with the Allied commanders, ostensibly to discuss terms for his surrender. When Prince Dolgorukov arrived at the French camp as Alexander's representative, he found Napoleon pacing nervously, his uniform disheveled, his manner suggesting a man on the edge of defeat. Napoleon played his role to perfection, speaking of his precarious position and the difficulties facing his army. He hinted at his willingness to negotiate, to perhaps cede territory in exchange for safe passage back to France. To Dolgorukov, it seemed clear that the great Napoleon was finally ready to admit defeat. But while Napoleon performed his masterpiece of deception, his marshals were secretly positioning the Grande Armée for the most devastating counterattack in military history. Hidden by fog and careful movement during the night, French divisions slipped into positions that would allow them to strike at the exact moment when Allied forces were most vulnerable. Marshal Soult, commanding the 4th Corps, was given perhaps the most crucial role in the coming drama. His men were positioned to retake the Pratzen Heights at a moment's notice, but they remained concealed in valleys and behind ridgelines where enemy scouts could not detect them. Soult's soldiers waited in perfect silence, their muskets loaded, their bayonets sharp, their hearts beating with anticipation. Marshal Lannes commanded the 5th Corps on the right flank, his veterans positioned to pin down Allied forces and prevent them from escaping the trap that was about to be sprung. These were soldiers who had followed Napoleon through a dozen campaigns, men who trusted their emperor's genius, even when his plans seemed incomprehensible. On the left flank, Marshal Davout's 3rd Corps was executing perhaps the most grueling march of the entire campaign. Racing through the night with minimal rest, these iron men were positioning themselves to seal off any Allied retreat. Davout himself rode among his exhausted troops, urging them forward with promises of glory and plunder. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite reserve, remained hidden near the emperor's headquarters. These were the chosen few, veterans of Marengo and Austerlitz, men who would die before they would retreat. Their presence was Napoleon's insurance policy, the final card to be played if all else failed. As the 1st of December dawned, the Allied commanders finalized their battle plan with supreme confidence. They would launch their main attack against the French right flank, rolling up Napoleon's line like a carpet. Once the French right collapsed, the entire enemy army would be forced to retreat or face annihilation. It was a sound plan, one that should have worked against any conventional opponent. But Napoleon Bonaparte was anything but conventional. The French emperor spent the evening of the 1st of December visiting his troops, moving from campfire to campfire like a father checking on his children. His soldiers gathered around him with devotion that bordered on worship, their faces illuminated by flickering flames as he spoke to them of tomorrow's battle. Napoleon's words were electric, filled with confidence and prophecy. He reminded his men that tomorrow marked the anniversary of his coronation, surely a sign from Providence itself. He spoke of the glory that awaited them, of the crushing victory that would make them legends. Most importantly, he assured them that he had prepared a trap so perfect that their enemies would walk into it with smiles on their faces. The soldiers roared their approval, their voices echoing across the Moravian countryside. They had followed this man from the sands of Egypt to the plains of Italy, and he had never led them to defeat. Tomorrow would be no different. As midnight approached, Napoleon retired to his tent to make final preparations. Maps covered every surface, marked with troop positions and movement arrows in red and blue ink. Dispatches arrived hourly from his scouts, confirming that the Allied army was positioning itself exactly as he had predicted. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Now all that remained was to spring the jaws shut on two emperors who believed they were about to witness Napoleon's downfall. But when the sun rose on the 2nd of December, 1805, they would instead witness the birth of a legend that would echo through the ages. The first rays of the 2nd of December pierced the morning mist like golden spears, casting long shadows across the frozen ground of Austerlitz. The temperature had dropped during the night, turning the morning dew into a crystalline carpet that crunched beneath the boots of soldiers preparing for battle. But it was not just the cold that sent shivers through the ranks of both armies. Something electric hung in the air, the unmistakable tension that precedes moments when history itself holds its breath. Napoleon stood atop a small hillock, his familiar silhouette unmistakable even in the dim pre-dawn light. His grey overcoat was buttoned tight against the morning chill, and his hands were clasped behind his back as he studied the terrain before him with the intensity of a hawk watching its prey. Around him, his staff officers maintained respectful silence, knowing that their emperor was performing the final calculations in a mathematical equation written in blood and steel. The sight that greeted Napoleon's eyes would have filled any other commander with dread. Across the misty plains, the Allied army was stirring to life like some great beast awakening from slumber. Campfires dotted the landscape in perfect military precision, each one marking a company, a battalion, a regiment of soldiers preparing to march against the French. The sheer scale of the enemy force was overwhelming. A sea of blue and white uniforms stretching to the horizon. On the Pratzen Heights that Napoleon had so mysteriously abandoned, Allied artillery pieces were being wheeled into position like chess pieces, claiming the most powerful squares on the board. The morning light glinted off brass cannon barrels and polished bayonets, creating a display that would have been beautiful if it were not so deadly. Russian grenadiers in their tall mitre caps stood shoulder to shoulder with Austrian infantry in their white uniforms, creating a patchwork of imperial power that had not been seen since the days of the great coalitions against Louis XIV. But Napoleon's eyes were not focused on the impressive display of enemy strength. Instead, he was watching something far more subtle, far more crucial to his plans. Through his telescope, he observed the movement of Allied columns as they began their descent from the heights, exactly as his deception had intended. The enemy commanders, drunk on their apparent advantage, were abandoning the very positions that could have made them invincible. The French emperor allowed himself the ghost of a smile. His trap was not merely being taken, it was being embraced with enthusiasm that bordered on reckless abandon. The Allied plan, so carefully crafted in the confidence of overwhelming numbers, was playing directly into his hands like a symphony composed by destiny itself. At 7 o'clock, as the morning mist began to lift in wispy tendrils, Napoleon summoned his marshals for the final briefing. These were men forged in the crucible of revolutionary warfare, veterans who had learned their trade in the brutal school of European battlefields. Soult, Lannes, Davout, Murat, each name a legend in its own right, each man a master of his craft. They gathered around their emperor with the easy confidence of professionals about to demonstrate their expertise. Napoleon's voice was calm, almost conversational, as he outlined the final details of his plan. The enemy would attack the French right flank in overwhelming force, believing they could roll up the entire French line. But this attack would strip the center of Allied forces, leaving the crucial Pratzen Heights defended by only a skeleton force. At the precise moment when the enemy was most committed to their assault, Soult's corps would surge forward and reclaim the heights, splitting the Allied army in two, like an axe-splitting kindling. The beauty of the plan lay not in its complexity but in its elegant simplicity. Napoleon was not trying to outfight his enemies, he was allowing them to defeat themselves. Every move they made in pursuit of victory would only tighten the noose around their own necks. It was warfare elevated to the level of art, a masterpiece painted in movement and timing rather than canvas and oils. As the marshals dispersed to their commands, Napoleon turned his attention to the weather. The morning fog was beginning to clear, but patches of mist still clung to the low-lying areas of the battlefield, like ghostly fingers reluctant to release their grip. This natural camouflage would be crucial in the opening phases of the battle, concealing French movements until the moment was right for revelation. At 8 o'clock, the Allied attack began with the thunderous roar of artillery. Russian guns positioned on the heights opened fire on the French positions, their cannonballs whistling through the morning air like harbingers of doom. The sound echoed across the valleys and hills of Moravia, a percussion that could be heard for miles in every direction. Peasants in distant villages stopped their morning chores and crossed themselves, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, the fate of Europe was being decided. The Allied infantry began their advance with the precision of a parade ground drill. Column after column of Russian and Austrian soldiers marched down from the heights, their regimental colors snapping in the morning breeze. The sight was magnificent and terrifying, a human avalanche of steel and determination flowing toward the French positions like an unstoppable tide. But Napoleon remained unmoved by the spectacle. His watch showed 8:30, and according to his calculations, the crucial moment was still minutes away. He had orchestrated this deadly ballet down to the second, and premature action would ruin everything. Patience, the virtue that had won him Egypt and Italy, would serve him once more on the fields of Austerlitz. The French soldiers holding the right flank began to feel the pressure as overwhelming numbers of Allied troops bore down upon them. These were veteran regiments, men who had faced impossible odds before, but even they began to waver as wave after wave of enemy infantry crashed against their positions. Officers shouted orders above the din of battle, trying to maintain formation as their lines bent like reeds in a hurricane. Marshal Davout's Third Corps, positioned on the extreme right of the French line, bore the brunt of the Allied assault. These iron soldiers, exhausted from their night march, found themselves facing odds that would have broken lesser men. Russian grenadiers charged with bayonets fixed, their war cries echoing across the battlefield like the howls of wolves. Austrian infantry advanced in perfect formation, their white uniforms making them appear like ghosts emerging from the morning mist. But Davout's men held firm, trading space for time, giving ground slowly and deliberately while extracting a terrible price from their attackers. Every hedgerow became a fortress, every stone wall a redoubt. The French soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew that their emperor's grand strategy depended on their sacrifice, and they were prepared to pay any price to ensure his success. Meanwhile, in the center of the battlefield, the drama Napoleon had choreographed was reaching its climax. The massive Allied assault on the French right had drawn the majority of enemy forces away from the Pratzen Heights, leaving only a thin screen of defenders on the crucial high ground. The trap was almost completely set. At 8:45, as if summoned by divine providence, the sun broke through the remaining clouds in a brilliant display that would be remembered as the Sun of Austerlitz. Golden rays of light illuminated the battlefield with startling clarity, burning away the last vestiges of morning mist and revealing the positions of both armies with perfect precision. Napoleon raised his telescope and studied the Pratzen Heights one final time. The enemy positions were exactly as he had predicted, weakened beyond recovery by their overconfidence in their overwhelming attack. The moment of destiny had arrived, and the Emperor of the French was ready to claim it. He turned to Marshal Soult, the man who would deliver the decisive blow, and asked the question that would echo through military history. How long would it take for his corps to reach the heights? 20 minutes, came the reply. Napoleon nodded, checked his watch one final time, and made the decision that would reshape the map of Europe. The order was given with quiet authority, almost anticlimactically after all the preparation and deception, but those simple words unleashed a force that would shatter two empires and establish Napoleon as the undisputed master of continental warfare. The greatest gamble in military history was about to pay its ultimate dividend, and the emperors who had come to witness Napoleon's destruction were about to learn why he was called the god of war. And so the sun that had risen on the 2nd of December as the Sun of Austerlitz set on a continent forever changed. Napoleon's masterpiece was complete, his deception flawless, his victory absolute. Two emperors had learned the bitter lesson that numbers mean nothing when facing genius, that overwhelming force crumbles before superior strategy. In a single day, the Holy Roman Empire breathed its last. Austria lay broken, and Russia retreated in tears. This was more than a battle. It was the moment when one man's brilliance rewrote the very foundations of European power and proved that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by the strongest army, but by the mind that can turn weakness into strength and make enemies dance to the tune of their own destruction.